So yeah, well, welcome to the Historic Happy Hour, everybody. Tonight is a special presentation about a guy whose name we all know, even if we don't know how to pronounce it. It's a peculiar name. Everyone who moves to Knoxville notices this name. They say, "Is it Ijams? Is it Ijams? Or is it Ijams?" Which I think is how it is actually pronounced. But he was a very interesting guy. He was much more than, he was a founder of what we know as the Ijams Nature Center, which he founded as a much more modest thing than it became in the last 20 years or so. But there's a lot more to him too. Harry P. Ijams. I think no one who's not a descendant of Harry P. Ijams knows more about him and his dramatic life, which was connected to Knoxville history in several junctures. No one knows more about him than Mr. Paul James, the guy that we share a building with here on Gallows Hill. But we're grateful. I'm grateful that Paul's taken a turn to do a show tonight, and on an especially interesting subject. And Paul's got a interesting book about the Ijams and the Ijams family out there, and about what, the origins of the Ijams Nature Center. But Paul was the former executive director of Ijams Nature Center for many years, and during a period that it was expanding really enormously over a period of several years, it became something really very different from what was originally the very modest little nature center that people remembered their grandparents going to do some bird watching. It's now become a place with extreme sports and fascinating trails and really interesting historic sites that have to do with the marble industry, that in ways that it never did in the past. But Paul James will be talking about Mr. Ijams a little bit later on this evening. I think he has a few more things to say first, but without further ado, welcome the guy I spent the day with is Mr. Paul James.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it. Before I start, I do want to say hello to some special people in the audience tonight, because when I started working on the Ijams book that I did for Ijams Nature Center, I'm sure many of you have already read it. Can't believe it's a decade ago or more, but I certainly would not have been able to do it without some great friends like George Kern and Ellen Kern. George is the grandson of Harry Ijams and Alice. Also, Mary Gallant, I see you name here, Mary. Great to see you joining us, another grandchild. Also, Martha Kern and her husband, John. And I see Rebecca Kern, George and Ellen's daughter, is on tonight. And I'll mention Stuart in a minute. But again, thank you. I would not have been able to do write that book and help Ijams on its way. And now 10 years later, I think it's fair to say that after I left Ijams, I maybe didn't think I would be telling the story much longer, but as I was saying to Jack today, I'm still on HP's stomping grounds, and we'll find out what I mean by that. But I'll get started with the presentation, and just a couple of announcements per normal, and then we'll get started. So Jack, myself, and Nicole, we all work with the Knoxville History Project. We're an educational nonprofit with a mission to research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. And tonight's talk is going to be recorded. If you have to leave early, or you'd like to share it with somebody else, you can find recording versions that Nicole puts together, usually up Friday afternoon or Saturday on our website, knoxvillehistoryproject.org, in the portal. You can find the recorded versions in our podcasts and dialogues section. And also on that section, you'll find a couple of other sections that we've created over the last couple of years on Smoky Mountain Explorers and also the Naturalist. There's a bit more about the Ijams family on those, and also some of their comrades and colleagues from back in the day, like Jim Thompson and Carlos Campbell and a few other folks like that might be mentioned tonight. So look out for those as well. Well, here's where I was going to highlight it. There you go. Want to thank again every week council members Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas for supporting this series, particularly during the pandemic. Particularly want to thank Stuart Ijams Castle, I guess one of the great grandsons of the Ijams family. Stuart was a past board member of the Nature Center, so Stuart's a great guy. And particularly thank you, Stuart, for supporting tonight's talk. And he chose this great little light illustration drawing that HP did probably in the early 30s, I think. A little bit of nature and also a little bit about something that's particularly Knoxville with the JFG coffee there. So it's one of my favorite drawings. So thank you, Stuart. So it's a privilege tonight to kind of be back. A few weeks ago, I did a talk on Jim Thompson, who was certainly somebody that Harry Ijams would have known. They were born within just a few years of each other. And I'm going to be talking about, obviously, Harry Ijams as a commercial artist, but he's a far more multidimensional person from history. He was a naturalist, of course. He was a conservationist. He was an expert birder. Could you call him an ornithologist? I think that's probably technically not, because he didn't study formally ornithology, as far as I know, but he was a very talented and a well-respected wildlife rehabilitator. He was a leader of Knoxville ornithology, not only in Knoxville, but really in East Tennessee and across the state. He was also an inventor as well, and we'll see a couple of the things and talk about a couple of the things that he invented in the presentation tonight. He was born into kind of a prominent family to a large degree, but as the family might tell you, he was very hospitable, but hated a party. So how did he, kind of had his foot in two worlds in a lot of ways. You consider his younger life and also his later life as well. He used his talents as an artist to help move forward the movement for the Great Smoky Mountains in the 20s. And when you think in the mid-20s, when that movement was getting underway, people in Knoxville would have been looking to people like Harry Ijams as an expert, someone who'd been in the mountains many, many times over the years. In fact, really, if you go back into the historic record through the local newspapers, he does get mentioned for going to visit the Smokies in the late 1880s, the 1890s, and certainly in part of the 20th century. This is 2 or 3 decades. Well, the Ijams family name came to Knoxville in 1866. The Deaf and Dumb Asylum, or later be called the Tennessee School for the Deaf, located right next to where Jack and I are sitting here on Summit Hill, as we would call it, or Gallows Hill, as we like to call it in our newsletter. We still do on a daily basis, but literally 200 or 300 yards from this office is the old Deaf and Dumb Asylum that was created in 1848, opened officially in 1851. Like many public institutions, of course, was used as a Civil War, as a hospital during the Civil War, both for the Confederate Army and then the Union occupation after that. Like most of these public places, they went into quite a series of a state of disrepair after the Civil War, and it had to be brought back to prominence. One of the most talented and recognized deaf and dumb teachers in the country was this fellow called Joseph Ijams, originally from Rushville, Ohio, studied elsewhere in Iowa and Washington, D.C., and was particularly hired by the trustees of the deaf school here to bring back the school to prominence, which he came to do in 1866, and that's when the Ijams family name came to Knoxville. And this is a shot probably a couple of decades later, really, in the 1880s. But of course, Harry Ijams, one of 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, would have grown up, particularly Harry, of course, in the 70s. Of course, his father was at the school from 1866 till 1882, when Joseph died suddenly. He had some head injuries, and which they didn't quite understand what we were dealing with. But unfortunately, he died when Harry Ijams was just 6 years old. So when I talk about HPs, and I say Harry or HP interchangeably, his name was Harry Pearl Ijams. Later it became just known as HP, but this is Ijams stomping ground. So it's kind of funny that I worked for 16 years or whatever at Ijams in South Knoxville on HP stomping grounds, and here we are again, just literally yards from his stomping grounds. So this is where he grew up. Joseph Ijams and his family lived in a cottage on the property, which is still here, and today. It's still here again today. It's maybe a building that's slightly overlooked, but there's the date of when it was originally started being constructed in 1848. And it's a long time since I've been in the building myself, but if you've not been down lately, I guess it's a couple of years now, but this has a wonderful new statue, one of the newest statues in Knoxville of Abraham Lincoln. It has been the site of the Lincoln Memorial University for quite a few years now, I think. So that's how Harry Ijams' family name came to Knoxville. Of course, you know, when you think about Knoxville in the 1880s, quite somewhat different from now. In a lot of ways, it's kind of the same. We still have the marketplace. This is where I'm sure that young Harry and his sisters and brothers would have walked through, either going to school or to shop. This is one of the earliest versions of Market Square, the old market house, the old city hall in the background there, and in the ghost in the back, you can, on the top left, you can see the Immaculate Conception Church that was built about 1885, which is right behind Jack as today. But you know, just a couple of glimpses of the life of Knoxville and Knoxvillians around that time. Of course, you know, this is the famous 1886 bird's eye view of Knoxville. Harry was sent to the Hamptons Sydney School, which is right here. If you can see H, this is on State Street, right at the corner of Commerce. If you went down there today, you would see the Marble Alley Lofts. So that's where he went to school. It's a private school, a well-to-do school that was started around about 1810 and named after the famous Hampden-Sydney Academy in Virginia, and mainly a boys' school, but girls did certainly go later on. Lasted into the century and was been torn down in about the 1930s, according to Jack. And I think about a decade ago, the steps that were part of that building were still there before Marble Alley was built. But luckily, we have a great photograph from 1887 of here's a bunch of boys. Can't remember which grade they're in. I've never great on grades because I didn't study in this country. But on the front row, we have young Harry Ijams, which is wonderful to see. Some of the family members recognize his ears, which are very distinguished and help you recognize Harry. But there's a couple of other people as well that is worth mentioning. A couple of rows behind, we have Albert Kern, which George Kern, again, is with us tonight. George, this would be your other grandfather, whose son, Albert Kern Jr., married HP's, your mother, George, Josephine, in the 1930s, I guess, or 1940. And also we have far left, or my far left, is Arthur Ogden, which is another great friend or a lifelong friend of HP's, who was involved in the. Also, I want to highlight because we'll jump ahead to South Knoxville and Island Home. This is where the boys were on their picnic at Perez Dickinson's estate. Perez Dickinson was a wealthy Massachusetts businessman that came to Knoxville. He was very successful here as a merchant and involved in a lot of civic affairs. But you kind of put it into context where they are now. You know, if you can pretty much imagine the gates of the Tennessee School for the Deaf at the far end there of the Island Home Boulevard, this is where we would be looking. So they would have come down probably on a horse carriage across the old Gay Street Bridge and deep into what they would have thought as South Knoxville at that time, and through the gates of this massive, expansive Island Home estate. And I guess it's coincidental, as we'll find out soon, that when Harry and Alice, his new bride, decided to pick somewhere to live in 1910, it was a part of this, a former part of this estate. So when Jack and I get into doing more and more about South Knoxville, this is certainly a big part of Knoxville's history that we look forward to getting into more. But you know, in the mid 1890s, when Harry Ijams was a young man, he was sent to Cincinnati, the Cincinnati School of Art, to study caricature drawing. And this was a photograph. This is an illustration I found very curious. It's actually a trachea as a part of an anatomical drawing of a chakalaka, which is a kind of an exotic bird for us in the States. But I found this on Google Books. This is probably the only surviving example of an illustration that I know dating back to that time. And I believe that the school that he went to was closely associated with what we know as the Cincinnati Museum of Art, which is a wonderful art museum in Eden Park in Cincinnati. And I know that HP visited Cincinnati several times as well in the ensuing years, but trying to piece together his schooling is a little challenging. He definitely studied at Cincinnati for a couple of years at least, and then certainly went to the University of Tennessee, where he continued to study art. Anyway, this is just a standard picture of UT. It's kind of a little shocking to see it these days, which it's been so kind of rural looking, but here we're looking across Cumberland Avenue up to the hill, where Harry would have studied in the 1890s. And one of the great finds in the last several years has been, University of Tennessee, as I've said before, has a fantastic digital collection, and they have probably all of the existing volunteer handbooks. If you go back into 1897, is really, in terms of the Harry Ijams illustration story, it is one of the greatest finds. Here he's being recognized as part of the illustration crew, the art crew. He says here that Mr. Ijams and Wegner and Bishop, along with Mrs. Ellen and Catherine Wiley. So Harry Ijams was in good company when he was studying at UT. Of course, Catherine Wiley, one of our greatest local artists, and her sister, as well as her other one, Eleanor, were all artists in their own right, but none as famous and perhaps as talented as Catherine. But here, cover is done by Mr. Ijams. And these are the next few slides are just a few examples of his kind of early work, which is kind of a little bit shocking to see when you consider the later ones that are very related to nature or Knoxville related. But well, not this one anyway. This is not shocking, is it? His signature is quite different, and his sense of style is quite different too. Promoting football at UT in its fairly early days. The Glee Club, a little different. Most people who know Harry Ijams' work from just a little bit would probably think they may not have seen this one before, from 1897. Kind of a macabre scene. The military department, with this caricature there of Washington and Napoleon at the top, and General Lee as well. And another one promoting, I guess, his life in the fraternities. Very Halloween-esque. Again, not what you consider typically associated with Harry Ijams. This is a photograph of him from the same yearbook, and here he is on the front row. Apparently his brother is in there as well, Howard, and I'm not sure if this is the one on the far left, but it doesn't actually say, but I'd love to figure that one out. A year later, in 1898, and thank you for Bob Davis, is one of our regulars, for sharing this with me. Bob spends a lot of time on the microfilms down at the McClung Museum, and this is really one of the earliest published images that Harry Ijams did. This is of Camp Poland, which was also down in Mechanicsville, Beaumont area that Jack and I discovered a few weeks ago. But it also had a presence, and as well as a hospital. We're looking at kind of that intersection of where Emory Place is, where Central comes into Broadway. You can see the National Cemetery, or just north of there rather, where the Old Gray and National Cemetery is. And again, this is one of his early drawings that was in the Sentinel, the Knoxville Sentinel rather. And apparently he worked there, according to this article on the right, announcing that he was going to leave Knoxville and be employed by this magazine called Armstrong Magazine to take over the artwork there. So we know that Harry definitely left Knoxville a couple of times, Cincinnati, Atlanta. We know that he later on lived in Florida for 2 or 3 years for some reason, which we're not quite sure, but definitely had some experience in and out of Knoxville. One of the most surprising things that I've discovered recently is there was some tragedy that Harry had to, experience in his life. Certainly it was a young lad, his father dying very suddenly when he was just 6 years old. But in 1901, he was on this boating party of 16 young people. He would have been in his 20s by now, sorry. But they were boating on the Tennessee River, probably around about the vicinity of where we would put KUB. And a steamboat, the Isabella King, came down the river towards downtown and created a wake. And this fellow, this young man, Samuel Logan, who was in another boat, his lady friend, this Miss Louisa Guion, fell out the boat, and Samuel Logan jumped in to save her. She was saved by somebody else. The current was extremely fast, and the person in the next boat closest to him that was able to jump in or decided to jump in and help him was Harry Ijams. He tried to help Samuel Logan. Both of them got swept down in fast currents. Harry had him in his arms for a few moments, and then he slipped away. And the next thing that Harry Ijams knows that he's been pulled out of the water and collapses. And the next minute that he's waking up on the shore of the river, and he'd been unconscious. And so this was a big event in his life, and it was very hard for HP to discover that his friend Samuel Logan, who was the son of a local judge, died. He did drown on that boating accident. We also find out through the story that when Harry was interviewed the next day, that he had actually experienced something very similar, like 2 weeks before. He was on another boating trip. He'd had to jump in to save somebody else. He did save them, but that this was a tragedy that he had to experience when he was in his early 20s. So this is a new story that I'd never heard before. Just goes to show that the river down there was still a dangerous place as it can be today. This was in 1901. Also, when HP was waking up on the bank, I want to mention that his brother was the local physician, the local doctor that showed up, and here he is. A little later, probably in about 1910, I think. S.B. Boyd, Sam Boyd of the Chief Fire Department, which is on the right. I think he passed away, I think, in a few years after this in a fire, and is immortalized down on Summit Hill as the fireman's memorial. Another part of the tragedy of HP's life is that in 1923, Howard Ijams was killed by accident in a streetcar accident on Magnolia Avenue when he was hit, or killed rather, when a streetcar and an automobile collided in 1923. So family members may not know that story too. Of course, his other brother, Ed, who was probably over in Townsend at this point, working with the Little River Lumber Company and railroad. But HP's really commercial art career really got into full swing when he joined the Knoxville Engraving Company. Was a designer there, became a manager there, and was very involved, and as well as an owner of it for several years. The Knoxville Engraving Company produced several publications that Jack and I kind of use over time. On the right, this Knoxville souvenir guide from 1908 and Progressive Knoxville's kind of early kind of Knoxville booster publications. They're amazing for us to find old images of Knoxville that we use quite a lot in our programs. And I think someone donated these to Jack a few years ago. So they did all the illustrations and the plates for them. And I believe this is their office that they worked out of on State Street in those early days. Again, thanks to Bob Davis. This is a 1903 drawing that HP did, promoting, kind of the move to kind of suburbia and owning your own home in 1903, kind of encouraging people to kind of move out the city. Of course, when HP was a young lad and going to college, that Knoxville was really rapidly growing, and as Jack has written many times, the population of Knoxville has quadrupled really between in the 1880s and 1890s. So these are kind of early examples of Harry Ijams' kind of commercial art, and it does kind of give us an insight into the life and kind of growth of Knoxville. Here is a couple more. Or maybe traditional engravings that HP did, and we know he drew them because there is his kind of signature stamp on the left. I think that's an 03. This is one of the giants of the kind of the manufacturing industry for Knoxville in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And here's another one, the Chavannes Lumber Yard. I think that was, correct me if I'm wrong, in North Knoxville as well. Oh, Lincoln Park is at the foot of Shotbridge. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that comment there on the chat bar. But also, even though he was very involved with the Knoxville Engraving Company and kind of remained so, he certainly went out on his own. In 1912, he went in partnership with an Albert Gredig. I didn't highlight him, but actually he was another student that we could have pointed out in that old Hampden, Sydney photograph that we looked at a few years ago. But by 1990, he's clearly on his own as a commercial artist. Again, you know, specializing in blueprints and patented drawings, which we'll get into in a bit, and kind of the similar work that he would have done with the Knoxville Engraving Company. A couple of other kind of examples. This is a kind of a classic illustration of the McClung warehouse that until the fire, probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, again, would have been kind of here on Summit Hill on West Jackson, a powerhouse of Knoxville business over the years for many years. And I have this in the office hanging up. You may have seen this before, but this was probably a special illustration for the Knoxville News Journal and Tribune, rather, in 1921. The busy spots in Knoxville. I'll highlight a little bit for you. You know, obviously, Harry had a lot of understanding of not only where buildings were placed, but also how to portray them in context and also in scale. You know, you can look at these things kind of all day. There's just a lot of accuracy in terms of the buildings and what was there at that, you know, kind of a snapshot of time. But also, you know, we talk about his imagination and wit. Is just, you know, little cars colliding with the traffic control posts that you may have seen in some older photographs and all kinds of things. These are just, and the airplanes, yes, it's just neat little drawings that really lasted, you know, puts us in perspective. You know, some of the buildings along Wall Street, that's probably not a street that we think of a lot with the TVA towers there these days, but you know, the Stratford Hotel that you could see here and old Mayo Seeds were here for a long time. You may recall that we showed one of Jack Neely's photographs that he took in the 70s of that stretch, and maybe we might revisit that next week as well when we look at rare glimpses of Knoxville. But this is a really fantastic example of HP's not only artistic talents, but as an understanding of Knoxville life as well. This one is just one that I discovered 2 or 3 weeks ago. In the early 20s, Knoxville kind of chamber and business coalitions were promoting Knoxville. Knoxville naturally. I mean, was that prophetic? That's kind of the thing that we've been doing with the urban wilderness and what Ijams has been doing for years, of course. But, you know, kind of Knoxville is trying to reframe itself as being a very outdoor place. And here we see that the photographs were by Jim Thompson and his crew, Knoxville Engraving Company again, and all the artwork, at least in terms of putting it together, was done by H.P. Ijams. This is just a snapshot here of a page or two. Again, this is just a very slender kind of boost of publication, promoting, extolling the virtues of benefit, you know, culture and business of Knoxville, and here's particularly UT. I want to pause there for a minute and talk about the family. Back to the early 1900s, 1905, he married Alice Yeo, who was the daughter of John Yeo, who was the one-time mayor of West Knoxville, or what we would call today Fort Sanders. She came from a very prominent family, just like HP himself. And actually, his mother, HP's mother, I believe, after she left the deaf school, which she remained a teacher after her husband passed away for many years, but did build a house right in the heart of what we call Fort Sanders on 6th Avenue at Clinch, which we would call today, thank you, Jack, 14th Street and Clinch Avenue. The Yeo house would have been one on the side of the street, and Mary Aiken Ijams, HP's mother, would have been on the other. But I'm pretty convinced that this photograph was taken probably not long after that. Maybe they were courting or maybe even married at this point. But I think we're looking down on the north side of the Tennessee River to the very, very tip of Dickinson Island in South Knoxville, very close to where they would choose to live. And again, by this point, you know, HP was certainly hiking in the Smokies, exploring the Smokies, and the couple did choose to spend their honeymoon at Altamont and exploring the Smokies. So can't be many people that would have done that back in the day. One of the things that we know is that on a subsequent wedding anniversary, that they packed up and they canoed all the way from Knoxville all the way down to Chattanooga, which I think took like 7 or 8 days. And it rained a lot all the time. They got completely drowned, but they had the great sense to send a clean pair of clothes each by mail that they picked up when they got there. I think they spent a lot of time bailing water out of the canoe, but this is probably not from that trip, but it just gives you kind of a visual sense of HP and Alice in the next shot here. It's a little faded a bit, but you know, I want to thank Martha Kern particularly for some of these really, really early photographs that just give a sense of these kind of outdoor adventurers back then. And there's often a little dog that you can see. There you go. I don't know whether this was taken on Tennessee River, could have been anywhere, but you can certainly put your mind there in the early 1900s. But at the same time, you know, they were kind of a dapper family, at least in those days. You don't think of, when you see some of the older photographs, is this really HP dressed up there in the hat? But whether this was in Knoxville or elsewhere, we will never know perhaps, but we're getting into the family years now. But before we do that, I want to comment on kind of the sense of place that you will still find at Ijams. They lived on Sevierville Pike at some point, which I'm not quite sure exactly yet, but they did move this log cabin to this new place that they purchased, this about 24 to 25 acre lot on the most eastern part of the Perez Dickinson lot, you know, Perez Dickinson estate in 1910. HP at this time, you know, would have been working downtown Knoxville. This is quite a bit away. And the reason I want to just use this photograph is that for quite a lot of time, he would ride a horse from the log cabin to the end of the streetcar line, you know, in the early, you know, 1912, 1915 type, you know, there'd been development of the Island Home Park neighborhood. And that's where the, you know, it was fueled by, growth was fueled by the streetcar that was servicing that area. And he would presumably get his horse out in the morning. And he did have he did have an invention of on hitching a horse very easily and simply, which I'd love to learn more about. And then presumably hooking up his wagon, his horse for the day while he was downtown working at Knoxville Engraving Company or on his own. But in 1923, he did add on to that one-story log cabin, and he did a lot of it himself with one other helper. So again, we're getting, not only was a talented commercial artist, but he obviously was very inventive. He was very good with his hands, and he had a sense of vision of what he wanted to do with the greenhouse and the sleeping porches on both floors. I've often wondered whether they maybe had an infusion of capital to do this. This is probably around about the time that his brother Howard was killed. I did find some references to, to the settling of his estate, which might have fueled that. I don't know, but it is curious to conjecture that. But you can get a sense even now that the Ijams farmers, I guess as they called it back then, started to have a sense of place. And that was also because, you know, they waited to the mid-20s, whether it was, or they did get some money to develop the house more. They spent a lot of time on the gardens. And, you know, by the mid-20s and early 30s, it really was known as a semi-private showplace that people came out just to see, with all the gourds hanging up and all the trees and the roses and the boxwoods and all that. Bob is asking when this building was replaced. Actually, this was torn down in the late 90s, and we'll get back to that later on. But this was definitely there through the 1960s as the nature center, which we'll get into in a bit. But certainly by the end of the mid 20s, late 20s, early 30s, it's probably in the best shape that it was ever going to be. This is a slide from UT Library, as garden slides. Great to see a color photograph, or a hand-tinted one at least, from that era. It's just wonderful. Gourds attracting wildlife and birds and stuff. The other things that you can still see at the original acreage is what is now would be called, I guess, the Lotus Pond still, or one of the ponds down on the Discovery Trail. But again, HP's inventiveness, deciding that rather than let his daughters, that we'll meet in a minute, swim in the Tennessee River just off the property, to build his own lake, which he did presumably with some good help in 1922. And here's a picture of it kind of finished. We'd love to, of course, wanted to kind of see that little bridge put back. Obviously, it's silted up over the years, but you could still go back now and find Lake Avis, or Lotus Pond, as it was called. It was called the Lotus Pond because that they planted Egyptian lotuses in there that would track the sun during the day, and it was just an amazing thing that people came out to see. And this is another one of those UT garden slides of that era, just from a slightly different angle. So the Miller building that replaced the Miller Education building, where the daycare is at Ijams, is up on the hill, up on the right there, and the parking area would be beyond these trees. The visitor center now would be up on the bank to our left. But in 1923, this photograph was in the local newspapers or something very similar, and just want to pause and talk about the four daughters. Harry and Alice had four daughters. You've got Martha on the left, the youngest, Elizabeth or Izzy, in the left of center there, who was the oldest. You've got Mary and Josephine, which was second oldest. All great swimmers, all great girls, all great outdoors girls, and spent all their times either in the sleeping porches, going to sleep, or outdoors. I mean, it was just, you can still go to Ijams today and get a sense of what it was kind of growing up at the old part of the old home site. And these are just 2 or 3 pictures that I particularly like out of the book. This is not Alice. This is not their mother. This would be, I guess, their aunt, Alice's sister, Mama May. There's always dogs or, rabbits in these photographs. It just must have been a very almost kind of magical time for the girls to live and grow up in this kind of scene just beyond downtown Knoxville. Here's Martha on the left and Mary on the right. Playing cards here. And a lot of what we know about those times was captured by Josephine. Here we are. You can imagine that she's typing the Ijams family newsletter that she started, I think it was in 1922, 1923, which she did for several years. And it's amazing to go back and listen to, read what she wrote about. And I'm sure there's some fact and some fiction in there, but just to kind of capture the crazy goings on of all the people that came and went and what went on during their lives. And amazingly, they had this kind of duplicator machine, which it's amazing to think that they had some kind of a photocopying device of some kind at that time that they made copies on. But when I was working on the Ijams book in 2010, it was just I said to Martha, do you have a picture? It'd be great to find could find a photograph of Josephine kind of working on the Ijams family newsletter, and it was just a wonderful that we did, and it's kind of one of my favorite photographs. So great to see all those. And the girls would also help, and their father with the kind of the family tradition that started in 1914 rather, of Harry Ijams' own family Christmas cards. This is the very first one from 1914 that just has the Elizabeth and Joe here. It's became kind of locally famous silhouettes. I'm just going to go through a few. This one is from 1920, showing all the kids and the dogs. There's Pep on the end. I guess maybe he's just passed away, replaced by Nancy. It's 3 in a row of Santa Claus promoting kind of the Ijams kind of radio station, or listening to the radio. The one in the middle is from 31 in the Great Depression. The skinny Santa and the empty sack and the emaciated reindeer. Again, this is HP's kind of imagination and wit coming out to the fore. And on, most surprisingly maybe, is the one on the right. This is best wishes from the Ijams family. This is the letters forming the word Santa Claus, forming Santa Claus's face. So probably won't have time to work that out right now, but there's the S and the A, and Santa Claus is what makes the drawing there. It's just wonderful. This one's, a tad more serious, promoting Knoxville and the great region. Here we have some highlights, and obviously the Public Works Administration promoting TVA and cheap power that was being promoted in the 1930s, capturing the sense of the Great Smoky Mountains and the Girl Scout camp, which the family was very involved in. That would have been at the Camp Margaret Townsend at Tremont. On the far left, you've got the Savage Gardens, which is that wonderful garden in Fountain City. And I can't remember, maybe it's the PWOA symbol of that HP is kind of using as a bit of a joke there, combining it with the East Tennessee Ornithological Society, which he was the co-founder of in the early 20s, which we'll get into in a minute. And probably, I think this is the last one I'm going to show for a bit. This is one probably maybe in the 1940s and the Second World War, referring to over here. Another great find in the newspaper archives on newspapers.com was, we're in the 20s now, and even though HP is in business for himself as a commercial artist, he's back working with the New Sentinel, which he was kind of a resident artist for a long, long time, but also did his private commissions. But it's hard to kind of separate the two exactly. But it's great to see some images here showing him working in that art department. Of course, he was also in 1926 here doing this. Is not an ad per se. This is actually, he is the Southern representative for the production company that put together the volunteer yearbook at UT, and he did these, I think, from 1925 to 1928. He is mentioned in other ones, but so he's still kind of maintaining that that UT connection. And it's curious that it's 08. Did he graduate? Did he go back and do another course in 08? I'd like to learn more about that. So it's an evolving story, however detailed as much we know it. But in 1928, he also did something else was pretty remarkable. He purchased an entire bird cabinet from this lady in Nashville, just to acquire the specimen of one bird. It was a very, very rare bird. It's this bird on the left with Martha, his daughter. It's a passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon was one of the most numerous birds ever to live in the world. It was resident here in North America, flew in gigantic flocks from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and back. On the annual migrations. Locally, Pigeon Forge is partly named after it, the Pigeon River, of course. Could talk all day about the passenger pigeon, but it did become extinct for many reasons in 1914 in Cincinnati Zoo, of all places. Did HP see the last one? Called Martha, by the way. It's curiously, we have Martha looking at a descendant of fellow companion of Martha. Martha was the last passenger pigeon that died. But also HP wrote this quite well-written monograph on the passing of the passenger pigeon. What's also special about this bird that he acquired, though, is, and this is a remount that the Great Smoky Mountains National Park did maybe about 8 or 10 years ago. It was on display at Ijams Nature Center as part of a lost species exhibit for a couple of years, about a decade ago or less. But this is really one of the finest examples of this species that I've seen. And also, it's the only one that has a provenance to Tennessee. It was collected by Confederate General Cheatham, Benjamin Cheatham, in 1856 near Nashville. So it's the only one that we know that definitely can be pinpointed to live in at one point in Tennessee. So it's typically not on display at Sugarlands, unfortunately, but it's in the Twin Creek Science Center up there on Orchard Road. But if you're interested in learning more about the passenger pigeon, definitely worth checking out the writings of Harry Ijams on that. And kind of staying on birds a moment, but also get back to his kind of inventions. Same year, or within a year of this, HP patented his own nest box, and it was kind of a curious design that it could be either in wood, or it also could be used in kind of tar paper, and you could reach up and with one just twist of the wrist unhook the central portion, and it was hanging on this nail, and inspect the nest. And it was just a very, very handy device that he used throughout the Ijams farm and promoted it, and presumably sold quite a few in the Migrant. This is an ad from the Migrant, which is the quarterly journal for the Tennessee Ornithological Society. But a very, very ingenious design. And this is a kind of a drawing that he did, a map of the Ijams farm in 1923. Apparently he had about 100 of these nest boxes all over the property. And I think probably what some of these dots are all over the place. One of the kind of the funny things that I saw written about him in the Ijams newsletter that Joe did was that he had chairs all over the property, and if he had a chair in front of a nest box, he played hell if anyone wanted to move it, even if it was in the middle of the driveway, particularly during the nesting season. He wanted to be able to sit there and observe with great accuracy what went on. So all this kind of nature stuff, you know, he was living every day on the Ijams place. And again, this is that photograph that we saw earlier, kind of reaching over a little of the rock ponds to inspect what was in the nesting box there. I want to mention that one of the probably his biggest tragedies of his life was that Mary Ijams, the third oldest daughter, died in a car crash with her sister Elizabeth. Was in the car. Elizabeth survived, of course, but Mary was killed instantly when their car crashed in 1932, and he was only 16. And I always think of that when I look at this photograph because you know, in their grief, one of the things that HP did was kind of develop the gardens more and develop the rock gardens and some of the rock pools, which you know, have been rehabilitated over time, but it's still kind of there at the Ijams place today. So that was one of the other tragedies, you know, with his father dying and his brother dying suddenly, and now is one of his daughters. If you ever have had a chance or have yet to watch the documentary that the Heartland series did on the Ijams family, that's a big central part of the you know, the kind of emotional thrust of that documentary, which is very poignant. You know, kind of going back in time, but also alludes to where we are today with the Ijams Nature Center and the size that it is. You know, that it was kind of an outgrowing of the East Tennessee Zoological Society, or a lead up to rather. Harry was involved very heavily in the late teens and early 20s with the East Tennessee Audubon Society. And one of the great things about it was that they created what was called the East Tennessee Bird Preserve. And right in the heart of it was the Ijams family farm. You had to become a member of the Audubon Society to enter it. Kind of Ijams was you know, HP was the kind of the de facto, you know, steward of the place. But it was dubbed by the Knoxville Journal, the Sentinel, the City of Birds. They counted 142 species, not only resident birds, but migratory species as well. And what we're looking at, this is Martha here, covered in sparrowhawks, is what they used to be called. They're called American kestrels today. And right in the middle is this curious little structure overlooking the Tennessee River, which I'm pretty sure is the next slide here. This is what they call the Magnolia Woodward Lodge. And the reason it came about is that HP said to the members of the Audubon Society, if you can get all the members to contribute and protect their own lands and post it as wildlife habitat, protect the wild habitat, I would give you the land to build a members lodge. And so he provided the land, and the members did build this wonderful lodge overlooking the Tennessee River, right adjacent to the Ijams home in 1922. And surely that's probably maybe Alice and some of the Ijams girls looking over the little wooden fence there. And it doesn't exist today. What it did burn to the ground in the 1930s, but it was replaced by the Girl Scout Camp Mary Ijams. I'm not going to kind of get into the Girl Scout story today, but there was a competition held to name that camp, and someone from the community did suggest Camp Mary Ijams. So that property is still there. It's now part of Williamswood. If you're familiar with the faux castle that's adjacent to Ijams, that's exactly on the foundation of what we're looking at today. In fact, it's actually on the foundation of the later model, which was on the same footprint of this one. So it's named Magnolia Woodward. She was a local teacher who was credited for the first official bird count in the state of Tennessee, I believe in 1902. But in 1920, end of 1923, going into 24, HP started a breakaway movement from the East Tennessee Audubon Society, and formed this East Tennessee Ornithological Society, which is still in essence today, it's now called the Knoxville Chapter of Tennessee Ornithological Society, or KTOS. So it's been around almost 100 years in itself. But he was an early president of TOS, and really, was regarded across the state as just being one of the seasoned and genuine leaders of this movement. That was a true expert in wildlife rehab and spotting birds. Apparently his hearing wasn't great, but so he wasn't great on kind of bird identification by ear, but hey, we can't all be great at everything. This photograph showing ETOS in 1933 is always a little poignant to me, because it's it's barely probably less than a year after Mary passed away, but we do see Harry on the left smiling and Alice laughing over on the right. But it just kind of typifies the spring the spring migrations that were documented at the Ijams place. People used to love to come and camp overnight and be fed by Alice in the morning. What's also curious about this photograph is that if you go and stand at the home site today, this lawn is very, very similar to what you would still find today, but you won't find the cabin. That cabin was lived in by two old ladies called Miss Giffin and Miss Johnson. And when Alice and HP bought that property, they allowed those two ladies to live in that cabin for the remainder of their lives. And of course, if you get into the South Knoxville and South Haven community history surrounding Ijams, those names, the Giffin name and the Johnson name, come up quite readily. So there's definitely a connection. I'd love to learn more about who those two ladies were. This is like 20 years later. This is a wonderful color photograph of 1952. What's particularly cool about this is Jim Tanner, the great ornithologist who studied the ivory bill woodpeckers, now in the shot. A whole bunch of other people. There's Josephine Ijams on the right with her family, Brockway Crouch here. HP and his old woolly brown cardigan that the family might get a chuckle about. He's not wearing his dapper clothes anymore, but he was wearing his brown kind of cardigans for a long, long time. And I believe this is Alice here too. So wonderful to get a great color shot of what the bird is in the 50s. Of course, back to his illustrations. He designed the cover of the Migrant, again, the Quarterly Journal in 1935. And amazingly, this array of bird life of birds across the state, this was so popular that it ran for 57 years. It ran from 1991. Why the KOS decided to change it is somewhat drab these days compared to this one. Apparently, though, HP was not always happy with some of the anatomy of the birds that he designed. I later read, but maybe that was the reason. But 57 years, the cover never changed. That's pretty astounding in anyone's book. But a couple of other photographs that you may not have seen before. This was one I found down at Thompson Photograph a couple of years ago. May have been taken by Jim Thompson himself, but this is in the mid-20s. Here he's looking again. He actually helped breed American kestrels while he was living at the Ijams place in the 20s. But this is probably one of my favorite photographs, and this is courtesy of Anne Winsauer, who's a descendant of the artist and writer Robert Lindsay Mason. This would have been taken about 1923. You've got to be skilled as a birder and have a great sense of composure to put a band on a juvenile bald eagle. Whether this was in the Smokies, I don't know, but it could well have been. Bald eagles, particularly golden eagles, were certainly residents of the Smokies back in those days, not anymore, but just love that photograph. Really looks like a seasoned naturalist that he was there. I want to segue briefly into the Smokies, kind of coming up to the end of the talk. We're going to cover a little bit of the Smokies and then kind of end on a few of his Knoxville illustrations, but kind of told the story elsewhere. But it was, obviously it was people looked to the Ijams family, particularly HP, as a great source of information. Here they are in 1925 on visiting the first official campsite on Mount LeConte that Paul Adams, the guy with the axe, set up. This Jim Thompson right next to them that composed and took the photograph. Really just a classic Great Smoky Mountains archive photograph. Here's another one of the Ijams family and a couple of hangers-on, including one particular remarkable hanger-on here, which is Harvey Broom right in the middle. This was taken by Carlos Campbell in 1927. It's just fantastic to see all the family a little bit older than they were, just 2 years younger. to capture that. And it does show actually that Carlos Campbell was a wonderful photographer in his own right. Good friend of Harry Ijams as well, that spent a lot of time visiting his friend at the Ijams place over the years. Yeah, there's Harvey Broom, co-founder of the Wilderness Society and a very important figure in regional conservation. I want to highlight a few of HP's commercial illustrations in the Smokies. This is a fold-out map that you could find in the back of the Great Smoky Mountains Hiking Club manual in the late 20s. I don't believe that HP was a member of the hiking club. He probably maybe done all his hikes that he wanted to do with the degree of measure or length that the hiking club were doing in the late 20s. He was, probably in his late 40s, early 50s by this point anyway, but incredible level of detail. The next one is this skyline that I think was quite famous or legendary in its own right. I remember a senior volunteer naturalist, Bob Harris, I think his name was, at Ijams 20 years ago, that used to say that people used to have copies of this and put it in their visors in the car and would try to identify the peaks of the Smokies as they drove, kind of beyond Maryville into the Smokies, probably through Townsend. Wonderful little drawing. Again, this was a fold out in the back of the Smoky Mountains Hiking Club manual in the late 20s. Here's one that would have probably sat under a plexiglass thing at a diner in Gatlinburg or somewhere. Here's a close-up of it. It's just, HP knew where the Girl Scout camps were. He knew all the mountains. He knew all the little quirks of, squirks of locale, but also culture. The new headquarters will be here. So obviously this is maybe before where Sugarland's visitor center went in. Sunrise and Myrtle Point, that would be on overlook, seeing the top of Mount LeConte. Just really showing his sense of fun, but also a sense of place as well. Of course, one of the great things that he designed, probably by commission, around about 1936, just as promoting the new park, was this series of one sheet of poster stamps promoting all the cultural and tourist type of dimensions of the new national park in the Smokies. He used his ability to understand the primeval forest. On the right, this is actually a reused or illustrated photograph of Carlos Campbell's, which you can match up of all the cascades and waterfalls in the Smokies. Trout fishing. The one on the right, I'd never really looked at this before, but it's bringing in some cultural significance. 2 years ago, I became an American citizen, and my swearing-in ceremony is in Greenville. And Jack came with me and my wife Meredith, and we went and visited President Andrew Johnson's old tailor shop, which is in the museum there in downtown Greenville. So straying a little bit outside out the park here, but we're promoting the region nonetheless. But this is just a wonderful set of stamps, and we know that they were printed in South Knoxville as well. So Knoxville was benefiting by the economic business of printing these, which we know at least was printed 2 or 3 times. Again, this is not U.S. postal currency. These were things that you licked and stuck on the back of your envelope. But wonderful set showing HP's artistry to the full, really. And kind of one of the last ones I want to mention, the great book, The Great Smoky Mountains, that was a really best-selling hit for several decades by Knoxville writer Laura Thornborough. HP illustrated the cover of the 1938 edition, and again, just a slightly different take on the culture and locale and geography of the Smokies. I kind of want to end on just highlighting a few of the illustrations that he did in Knoxville. And hopefully we'll continue to find some more. This is in 1935. This is a map of North Knoxville. We're going to zero in so we can see a little bit of detail. Again, this is just north of our office where we're broadcasting today. But he's highlighting the Standard Knitting Mill here, the Bob Taylor home, Here's that X on Broadway that we talked about earlier, where the old dummy line station used to be, the old fire department. I've always trying to figure out where that was. This would be right Emery, what we know as Emery Place, and the old Central Market. That was kind of short-lived, but that's kind of where we're looking right now. But up even St. Mary's Hospital is developed in Whittle Springs and all the way up to kind of Fountain City. Again, like he did in the Smokies, he has an ability to capture the geography, but also kind of the charm and all the diversity of different things in a community. Here's the southern part of it, showing Depot Street and the Southern Railway, Southern Station, even alluding to what Jack Neely would say is the Battle of Depot Street, I think in 1895, 96, when William Gibbs McAdoo and his efforts to establish a rival streetcar came to fisticuffs along there, and that's quite a story in its own way. But this would be wonderful if we could find some more examples of other Knoxville communities that HP did over time. And then the year after, when the Knoxville News Sentinel was celebrating its Golden Jubilee, 50 years, he did these series of illustrations capturing the city and also the way that it had grown from the frontier days. And I think that the News Sentinel was encouraging kids to kind of color these in, but here it says that they were drawn by Harry Ijams, commercial artist. Here's a couple more that he did here. Again, kind of showcasing the industrial and the manufacturing components of Knoxville business life, with beyond into the Smoky Mountains. By the way, Mr. Johnson just asked if these were available. I don't know if way you could get copies of these. These are just that I found through the local newspaper archives. There really is nothing exists today that HP did. Although the Ijams family might have some things, but some examples of the old family Christmas cards. But I think a lot of the stuff was either destroyed by or thrown out when Harry's design office was cleared when he retired. But surely that there is some original things still to be found. This is one of the last ones I want to show. These are chimney sweats nesting or roosting rather in the old chimney at the old Sentinel building. We're looking going downhill on West Church. Many of you probably remember the old New Sentinel building. At least I went in there in the early 2000s. The old New Sentinel building on the corner of Gay and Church is now where that squat little building is. The flower shop, which I think is vacant right now. And curiously, the chimney swifts are active slightly further south, I think in the Andrew Johnson building. Thanks to my wife, Meredith, telling me about that, because she works very close to there. So chimney swifts still thrive down there in downtown Knoxville. Of course, because he worked in the New Sentinel building, he was often available to suggest things that could be in the newspaper. And this was a photograph that is believed to have taken where great egrets were hanging down on the Tennessee River, and you can see the Henley Street Bridge in the background there. And this shows kind of a very upfront personal view of the old shoals. Probably this is from the 1920s. I can't remember the date of that, but he was very, very well primed to suggest cultural things, particularly pertaining to nature, back in the newspapers of the day. As he got older and retired, there's not many examples of his illustrations beyond the mid-40s. I think he retired at about 1945. This is kind of how I think he was in his older days, growing corn on his farm. But even until he passed away in 1954, his obituary said that he could converse on any subject like a diplomat. He smoked a very strong brand of pungent cigarettes that he loved to light and watch everyone stand back. But even in his older years, people would love to come and talk to him. And one of the things that he loved to do was he loved to share financial investment information and tips, which apparently were very accurate, even though himself he was not interested in heavily speculating on the stock market. But he did die when he was age 77. Sadly, he passed away in Maryville Hospital. And in those last days, he loved to read murder stories and do crosswords. So that's how I think of HP's last days in 1954. He is buried in Highland Cemetery. My good friend Lynn Bales took me up to see the Ijams gravestones probably about 10, 12 years ago. And it's just this lump of granite on the top of the hill there, overlooking, well, we can't quite see the Smoky Mountains now because of the trees in front of it, but surely you would have done back then. I'm not exactly sure when the stone was put there. Certainly there is a marker for Mary in 1932, but this is where Harry and Alice are buried. And if you ever go up the top of the cemetery of Bearden and look for this just big chunk of granite with that name Ijams, it really does, it's very, very individually stands out. I kind of want to end on this postcard that I normally show earlier, but this is, I guess, from my thing on what year? Yeah, this is 1930. But this is kind of, in a way, prophetic to me that he designed this. This is the layout, of course, of the Ijams family farm. But there are some things that you can still see today. As you come down through the parking lot where the old greenhouse was, you can still, there's still the circular loop. Bob, you asked about the replacing of the old house that was torn down in the late 90s, 1999, I think the year before or 2 years before that I came to Knoxville. I know Ijams family and the Ijams Nature Center wanted to keep it the best they could, but it was one of those situations where it was more expensive, I believe, to restore it than to replace it. But it is set on the foundation of the Ijams original foundation. The Hayes house, the John Hayes house, that was a good friend and a Scottish fellow of HP's that he was also in business at one time with. The chimney of that house still remains on what used to be called the Secret Pond Trail, if it's still called that. You could take from the top of the Discovery Trail right here from the parking lot. Of course, the Lotus Pool is still there. The little bridge is not, of course. It's a little differently configured. Upon the right, where the Wildflower Hill, the spring, would be where the visitor center is. And what's kind of prophetic, I meant, is that the Ross Republic Marble Company is to the right, is now all part of Ijams. In fact, that's part of what you would still think is older, but it was certainly part of the Nature Center's expansion, probably in the 1980s or early 90s before the visitor center was built. And now, across the road from there is Mead's Quarry, and then further on, the Ross Marble Quarry. So from 20 acres, Ijams is, I think it's 315 acres the last time I checked. I think they've added some property just east of Mead's Quarry. So, the Bird Club up on the left, that's where the Magnolia Woodward Lodge was, and then it was replaced by the Camp Mary Ijams, and now it's that's where the Williams Woodfolk Castle is. That's where the old cabin was down there on the lawn. Right here is Towhead Island, as the girls used to call it. I'm drawing a blank of what it's called right now. That little island in the inlet is still there. So there is still quite a lot of, the landscape is still largely the same. Otter Island, thank you, Bob Davis. I appreciate that. And of course, HP and Alice's legacy, as well as the girls and everyone who's been involved with the family and as a volunteer or a board member or staff member at Ijams, is just that what they created in 1910, starting off, but particularly kind of honed in the 20s and 30s, and their time with the Bird Club, and just promoting the culture of Knoxville and the Smokies through their art and through their hiking and wildlife preservation. It just continues to go on. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to have been involved for many years. It was a pleasure to write the book. If you're interested in buying it, you can buy it through the History Project, but you can also buy it from local bookshops and at Ijams. And I hope that they are still carrying the Heartland series DVD that we did. This is about a 50-minute documentary, and it was nominated for a local Emmy. I didn't win, sadly, but it was a pleasure to work on it. Still extremely watchable, and the Ijams family legacy continues. So again, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Particularly, I'll end my presentation there, and we will open up for questions. Jack, you want to offer any?
Well, yeah, I was just about to say that was a great presentation. I start thinking I know everything, and then Paul gives another talk, and I learned about a dozen things tonight. That I didn't realize. I've been making notes here for things to throw into stories and so forth. But yeah, there's so many little things to wonder about. I was wondering about the Christmas trees. Are they still those original family Christmas trees? Are they still there?
Yeah, that was something I didn't really mention. You would have seen them on that postcard. That was something that I think that the Ijams family may have introduced to Knoxville, or with one of the early, promoters of it, is to buy a tree with a root ball on it, put it inside your house, and after Christmas plant it. So if you go to Ijams today and drive around that little loop in front of the home site, that's where HP had planted a lot of those Christmas trees, which are on that postcard. But I can't remember why I read this, and maybe it was in the family newsletter. There were a couple of things that HP did that maybe Alice may have smacked him for. One of them was that he used a blowtorch, apparently, to try to get rid of some poison ivy. And I think that the Christmas trees may have been a victim of that.
Oh goodness.
And then the other thing was that he planted bamboo behind the house, and still there. Maybe Ben at Ijams does a good job of containing it, or whoever's been managing it ever since. But most people who know bamboo, it's pretty aggressive. But that's another thing probably you wouldn't do today. But maybe you can't criticize people in the past. I mean, it is what it is. Obviously, Christmas was celebrated in a big way. I didn't show photographs, but there are photographs in the book. It's really neat photographs of presents under the tree, and obviously I think it was a season that they celebrated with 4 girls, surely wanting some great Christmas presents. When I first did the book, I knew that there were some old photographs, and was envisaging the story being some more contemporary photographs, modern ones rather. But spending time with Martha and George and Mary Gallant, we just kept finding more and more photographs, and a lot of them are numbered. It makes you wonder whether at one point HP had a register of, who was in the photographs and what date they were. A lot of them you can figure it out, but photographs go astray, so it makes you wonder what may have been lost. Well, it's 7:22. We appreciate you joining us.